Are we good? Yeah.
Good afternoon. Hope everybody fed. Is this like the post-prandial meeting and nap period here? That's sort of how I feel. Thank you all for sticking around, and I think there are a few folks on Zoom as well. We thought, the Connections is not only about the celebration and the meal and kind of talking about load and faculty association this morning, but also about connecting on content and around the work that we do in the education space, and kind of exploring and digging in on some of our faculty's substantive expertise in teacher prep and educator development. So I'd really like to invite us to I won't do guided meditation, but to step back a bit from the day-to-day of our day-to-day crunch, and try and put yourself out 2 or 3 or 5 years and reflect on our field and where you think the field of teacher preparation and writ large is going, and what the world is going to look like, and what really exemplar programs are going to look like in 2 to 5 years. What are the trends that are shaping us, and how do we react? So if you think about why we're here as a college of education, our basic premise is that every child deserves a great teacher, and how do we do that? We do that through, I would argue, 5 things. One is we inspire, or we inspire, or we strive to inspire, to engage people in the profession of teaching. And why is the profession of teaching important? How does it tie to our mission as a community centered institution? And how do we cut through the noise that is affecting education so much today? And by that kind of inspiration, that's going to, the ideas that'll drive recruiting and bring in people to our institution. So imagine or inspire in the importance of teaching and learning. Second is we prepare new teachers, right? And we strive to really develop research-driven and clinically based teacher preparation programs that bring new people in an effective way into the profession. Third, we're lifelong partners of career educators. We support folks from novice teachers all the way through in the deepening and broadening of their content knowledge and pedagogy. So we support educators across their lifetime. And finally, we're leaders, and we support the development of leaders, because you can't have a great teacher for every child without the leadership of schools and systems to drive that kind of change and focus on student achievement and impact. So that's kind of why we're here. And I was hoping this afternoon we could have a discussion with our esteemed panel and colleagues in the room about, what does this future look like? So I think everybody here is NCE, so I don't have to introduce the group, but I will anyway. So, Kavitha Matsko recently joined us from, University of Chicago in the UTEP program, real expert in and has done a lot of work around mentoring and teacher preparation, and is our Director of Research and Innovation. Harrington Gibson chairs Ed Leadership and has worked, and the doctoral programs, and has worked a ton with CPS in the development of leadership cadres across Chicago public schools. Mark Shin chairs school psychology, real expert, published on quite a bit on assessment and accountability. And how do you think about data, in addition to his institutional mantra or mantle as our chief provocateur? And Andy Kuratari, who most of you know, who's director of online learning and online technology for the university. So, our hope is that these 4 individuals bring 4 different perspectives around sort of where we think we need to go, and the kind of things that are shaping us as a college. So the way we'd like to run this is, I have a couple questions I'd like to put to the group, and I'd like to give each of our panelists maybe 2 minutes to respond in brief, then respond a bit, react a bit to each other. We'll do that for 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion among the entire group. So, make sense? Everybody good? Okay, so, let's start with, stepping back and looking in the world that we live in every day. What do you think are the big trends that we need to be really cognizant of and getting ahead of, from where you sit, what does excellence look in our field look like, and what are the trends we need to respond to? And I'd like to start with, we're preparing new teachers. Why don't we start with, Kavitha, from a teacher prep perspective? What's your take on this?
So in response to the question, how do we get ahead of the trend? I actually think there are lots of things that we're doing already that have put us in that direction. I think my biggest wish for our collective work is to think about how we prepare teachers that are not just really good at knowing and reflecting, but actually able to do. So not just good at pedagogies of reflection, but actually effective in pedagogies of enactment. And I think about the work that Lee Shulman did when he was president at the Carnegie Foundation of the Advancement of Teaching, when he was raising this concern about whether or not teacher education in particular had signature pedagogies, right? That he could look across to other professions and see that there were practices that people were engaged in that were codified, but that why weren't we moving in the same direction in our teaching practice? And the fact of the matter is that, that was 15 or 20 years ago, and the field has actually come quite a long ways in different content areas, and we've learned quite a bit about what effective practice looks like for a novice. And I want to be really clear, and I know there are different perspectives about this in the room, but when I think about a novice teacher, I'm thinking about a well-prepared beginner, right? Like, what is it that a beginner needs to know and be able to do? And I think there are things that we can comfortably say that a beginning teacher, regardless of where they're teaching and who they're teaching, ought to be able to do well. And so what are those things? And we've since codified some of those practices. And so how do we bring those practices into our work? And I think in order for us to be able to do that, that means having a shared articulation or vision of effective teaching, right? Having a sense of what those practices look like across our collective work, and then being able to engage in deep clinical experience that allows our candidates to practice some of those skills. And so I think one of the implications here is thinking about our work as process-oriented, but also a little bit more competency-oriented. And I don't mean competency-oriented in that we're looking to check things off a list, or that the competencies themselves are the things that are our ceiling, but rather thinking about certain skills that we need to have as a baseline that all of our teachers can engage in. And I think in order to do that well, we need to shift the way we think. We think about our engagement with schools. We use the phrase, right, in teacher education of cooperating teacher, and I think that has so many interesting implications about the hierarchy and the relationship, right? How do we move to a collaborating teacher and really think about this extensive and intensive and explicit supports that we need to provide our teacher education partners, because so much work is happening in the field. So I would think about redesigning the role of mentor. I would think about redesigning our curriculum so that it's much more closely integrated with what's happening in schools. And then thinking about how we bring in learning sciences into our own work, right? We've moved a lot in the field about how adults learn, and how can we use that kind of research to inform our own practices. So those are just some of the things that I'm thinking about.
Okay, so thanks. I think we'll come back to a bunch of those ideas about what does effective practice, actually, really look like, and how does one get there. So you're dealing with new teachers, Harrington. You deal with, leaders from the principalship and the assistant principalship to the superintendent. How does this look from a leadership perspective? And trends you think we need to respond to?
Sure. And just a little bit about my background. While I'm speaking from a leadership perspective, I'm also speaking about this issue from a teaching and learning perspective. So I got my doctorate in teaching and learning and did a lot of work with educational leaders. But I think in terms of setting the context in the state of Illinois, it would be helpful to think about it from a state perspective and the redesign that principal preparation programs were required to do in 2010. Historically, on average, we have 450 to 500 principal vacancies across the state every year. Prior to 2010, tens of thousands of individuals had what was known as a Type 75 General Administrative Endorsement. And that allowed individuals to serve in the role of a principal, AP, dean, athletic director. So in terms of the numbers of individuals that were walking around with the Type 75 credential, research has shown that many of those individuals chose that pathway with no intention of ever leading a school. So there was a disproportionate number of individuals with the license. There's an average of 450 to 500 vacancies per year. And the state of Illinois, they instituted an approach where they wanted to reduce the number of individuals, have a certification that's specific to this principalship, requiring programs to emphasize the internship component, as well as to prepare principals who were able to serve as instructional leaders. So that's helpful context, and I think as a result in our program, when we think about 26 programs in Illinois preparing 700 candidates for the roughly 450 to 500 vacancies, it's more in proportion. And as a department, we have to make sure those individuals are highly prepared. I like to use Chicago as an example in CPS. 6 out of 10 principals leave before their 5th year, and research shows that they peak in their 5th year. 4 out of every 10 principals in CPS, according to a survey administered by the Chicago Public Education Fund, are leaving the district within 3 years. 7 out of 10 principals in CPS argue that reducing compliance would improve their job satisfaction. And 40 to 50% of principals in CPS feel they're ill-prepared in organizing the resources to actually improve schools. In terms of a trend, when I think about school reform and Patricia Graham's work and what it looked like over the last 100 years, and assimilation being the first wave, progressive education being the second wave, access, accountability, and now when we look at the new administration, a heavy emphasis on privatization and school choice, we see elements of all of those waves of school reform combined. So leaders, in terms of understanding the context that we work, really trying to engage, Gloria and I, we're doing a project, and Carlos as well, where we're coaching principals in Inglewood, working with 10 different universities engaged in principal preparation as part of the CLC to share information across programs. It's allowing us to tailor an experience that really draws on the perspectives of other professionals in the field, the principals within our doctoral programs, and making very strategic staff decisions and redesigning our curriculum so that individuals are prepared.
Okay.
Mark, you want to jump in on what you see in the kind of the...
Well, the most disturbing, let me take a more pessimistic perspective, because the trend that I see is actually an increased interest in alternative facts, and in the normalization of the perspective that all perspectives are equally valued, and that some things just ain't true, or that can be explained away. I mean, I think we still live in this culture where I call them culture that climate deniers, and I think we work in places in schools that deny things like what we know works and what doesn't work. And so how do we, in terms of preparing people for the future in an era where everything can be discounted, everything can be said, but that's not true, or my favorite, research can show whatever you want. And although people's opinions can say whatever they want, no, research can't show whatever you want. Poor research can. So we go back into this era where we now have more data that we don't use than ever before. Isn't that interesting? One of my favorite persons who writes actually was working for Educational Testing Service. And he said assessment is seductive because it gives the appearance of doing something without really changing instructional practices. It's easy to do. It's much easier to learn how to give a test than it is to change how you teach. And so schools spend a ton of time and energy building assessment data that are not related to improving pedagogy. So that's sort of this sort of downside perspective of an era of alternative facts where we think we can assess our way, and I'm an assessment person, make my living on assessment. We think we can make our way out of a mess by collecting lots of data. We have data for 30 to 40 years that says really the gap between rich and poor has not really changed in a meaningful way. We've had data for 30 to 40 years that says if a kid can't read proficiently by the end of third grade, those kids have a 4 times greater likelihood of dropping out. We've had data for 30 or 40 years that says a high school graduate is 63 times more likely to be incarcerated than a college graduate. And yet our educational practices remain largely unchanged despite more knowledge about how people learn and how to communicate that than ever before in the history of mankind. So how do we sit down taking these really weird sets of dynamics where more data are better when that's not true, good data are better, good data that are useful and change pedagogy or school climate are better? How do we actually translate that into action? How many principals leave? Because guess what? They're faced with an insurmountable job to be able to transform institutionalized poverty in 70-80% of the kids in Chicago without the tools to be able to do that, right? You fix it as the principal. And we lived with how many years that the notion that if the test scores show that the school isn't improving, there's a player waiting on the sidelines who's going to come in and fix that. We'll fire the principal, we'll close the schools. The good news is, again, I'll go back and we know now more than ever before how to change some of these variables. These are not questions where we need Nobel science-breaking research. If we would only implement, I believe it was Jerry Brophy who said 30 or 40 years ago, if we only implemented 25% of what we have known, we would transform our schools. I think we've got a long ways to go on that. And I think that that's actually the exciting part about being in higher ed.
Thanks. So Andy, what does this look like from the chief technologist perspective?
Well, thank you for the title, which I don't have, but so I will bring a very narrow view from where I sit in terms of supporting the development of online courses and blended courses with many of you with our team. So I look at it very, very simplistically here. It's number one, what are we training? What are we teaching these folks, these students of ours? So that's the curriculum and how we design it. So I'll go into, again, in there with a little bit of a technology focus of what I think these teachers should be able to do when they get into the classroom. But that's not by any means my area of expertise. And the other one is how we deliver that curriculum, which I think Kavitha spoke to a little bit in terms of the learning frameworks and understanding how adults learn, and whether we offer that in blended, face-to-face, online. I believe that we, using frameworks that exist, we can design pretty good courses as long as we are very conscious about how we're designing them. So, and that's where a lot of my work with my team has been around designing the online courses and blended courses. As I've said before, I'm a big fan of that communities of inquiry framework, and we use that in our design. But similarly, there are other frameworks, and again, once we design the curriculum for the teachers to teach children, I'm sure you're thinking about those in the courses. But from a very narrow technology focus, in my work with talking about blended design at NLU, and just reviewing what's out there in terms of literature and research and examples of where it works, it's actually a lot of it is in K-12. A lot of the examples that are being used and touted as great examples of where blended learning works are in that space. So with that, these teachers that we're preparing, they need to be able to, day one, not only excel in the knowledge that they have about the curriculum that they're delivering, but how to with respect to technology. So quick learners with technology, being able to apply the correct technology to the correct situations, again grounded in the frameworks. So that's how I see, again, in two big parts, the curriculum that we design for them and how we assess that, which I think will go to the next questions, but how we deliver it. So at the delivery here, I think we have, and we've moved from what I've seen in the past few years, made a lot of strides in making sure that we provide a little bit of standardization where it makes sense. And that's where, at its worst, if we design these courses to be cookie cutters, we've reduced the freedom of faculty to express themselves in the courses. At the very best, they provide really good guidelines where we all agree what those themes and important elements should be at a program level, and allow the faculty to bring in their creativity in the classroom. So with that, I'll.
So can I ask you guys to react to each other? So Andy just was speaking to kind of the potential to look at how we deliver content and the importance of maintaining a focus on quality. Mark touched on this idea that we have maybe more data and less knowledge, and using what we know. Harrington pointed to the facts that the situation where we have attrition and leaders in schools and districts feeling ill prepared, but at the same time, a just massive need for that kind of leadership. And Kavitha touched on, really being able to articulate a vision of effective practice that is around some signature of effective teaching that's around some signature pedagogies and changing the role of the cooperating teacher and being attentive to how adults learn. Reactions, from the four of you to what you've heard from each other.
So I'd like to react to Mark. When I went to ARA this year, I'll say one of the biggest takeaways was a keynote address given by Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. And thank you, Allison, for introducing me to her work. But the major critique that came out of that talk were the metrics that we use and how policymakers are very interested in the numbers because it's expedient, right? And in terms of the quote that I actually wrote down at that conference that Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot stated, "So I hope that we in our own scholarship and activism will disrupt the discourse and reframe the conversation, that we will resist the hierarchies of power and language that get in the way of authentic and inclusive representations of a humanistic education, and that we will challenge the disciplinary boundaries and the theoretical grids that inhabit our tackling of the naughty and nuanced questions that resist easy measurement." And the suggestion that she gave, if we as programs would talk about what's working well, what's healthy about our organization, what is good instructional practice, how can we provide a good experience for our students, then that should be the focus. The conversation would change. And in her words, she stressed looking beyond the body count and really delving deeply into finding those examples of education that are working and tailoring a conversation around those pieces. So, this whole emphasis of humanistic education, arguing that if you address some of the social realities that kids are doing, achievement will improve. But the metrics that we're using, have been pretty problematic. I saw you shaking your head.
Couldn't disagree more. Yeah. It's not like we don't know how to scale reading. Okay. It doesn't have to be super complex, but we have run away from our data for generations. The data show a picture of inequity. The picture doesn't seem to be changing very much. It's not a measurement problem. It's how those data are used or not used. You can make something really complicated. I was looking for a phrase that's decidedly colorful, but I can't find it, and I won't try to paraphrase it, but it has to do something with, you can slice a sausage with a jeweler's saw, but you still end up with bologna. And there's another one that I can't find the other part of it. So it's not a measurement problem per se. There is a measurement industrial complex, as we all know, right? We spent $350 million on 2 variations of a test that's supposed to measure one set of standards, that doesn't seem odd to anybody, right? Two different ways of assessing one set of common standards that's supposed to level the playing field, $350 million. That's how much PARC and SMART are balanced. We have the National Assessment of Educational Progress, a consistent, stable database for 40 to 50 years. We don't need new measures. We should actually start using some simple measures better. And I sort of react against, and I'll argue, the political correctness of against something being standardized. Most professions are standard, okay? A doctor does things in a standard way. A plumber does things in a standard way. And I look forward to the day when, as educators, I can get sued for malpractice. Did you know that educators don't get sued for malpractice? Why is that? It's because courts have deemed that we're not expected to have a common body of knowledge that we know, like a plumber, a mortician, a dentist, a veterinarian. We're not expected to have a standard body of knowledge. There's something funny about that in defining a profession. Assessment is part of that process. It's not the answer to that. And we spend more time collecting data than actually using the simple data that we have. Dropout rate is a pretty good indicator, right? Did you know dropout rates have gone down? But learning has not. With the 4-year rule of how many kids have to graduate, principals are under pressure to get kids to graduate, not necessary to learn anything. Right. Now, those are variables that there's also what's called the corruption pressure of socially important indicators, right? And so as long as we understand that there are good data and bad data, more data don't make better decisions, complex data don't make anything any better anyhow, there's some very simple indicators that other disciplines use. And we should probably get good at using some of those things.
He's like, not me.
Not me.
I'll take it. I'm not sure if you understood the point that I was making, because in listening to the comments, it seems like there's some agreement. Because my perspective and the research that I'm referring to, if you're not looking for places in education that works, looking for examples of success, it's always going to be overshadowed and it's always going to be missed. My argument is that when we look at some of the metrics and how folks are evaluated and the pressure that principals do feel, that we need to really get back to focusing on teaching and learning as a lever of school reform. How kids learn, how principals can support the learning of adults. Otherwise, what you'll see is in the case of Atlanta, where superintendents are modifying the numbers, receiving awards as superintendent of the year because the pressure of the metrics. And it takes away, it's very easy, as we think about assessment and accountability as a lever of school reform, it's more challenging to think about cognition and the art of instruction, how students actually learn, mind-brain science research, and how do you actually develop principals who can adequately lead adult learning, understand what good instructional practice looks like, understand how students learn and develop, and to create systems and structures to support other educators in developing kids' potential.
Andy or
I feel like I'm still collecting my thoughts, but I think that this is not an either or, right? It's a both and conversation. That I think that we need to be much more thoughtful about the kinds of indicators, both short term and long term, that we're attending to, and that requires a lot of resources and supports that actually teacher educators and schools themselves don't have. Like, we need to be looking to school districts and states so that we can create much better feedback loops about what our teachers are doing and what our graduates look like and what kind of work they're doing in order to inform our practice in a much more tighter way than I think currently exists. And at the same time, I agree with you, Harrington, completely, that there's the science of teaching, and there are these metrics that we need to get smarter about and use much more carefully, but we need to use them with a very in a very careful way, right? We need to pay attention to who it is we're teaching and how we elicit and support growth, right? And so one of the things that I was thinking about earlier that's connected to this a little bit is both I heard Harrington and Mark say, you know, schools haven't changed that much, right? We're things are pretty consistent, right? I think about Tayek and Cuban's work and the grammar of schooling, right, and how things have been persistent for hundreds of years, right? And so, what is it going to take for us to shift the culture around schools? It's not just about the indicators, and it's not just about taking on a humanistic perspective. We actually have to think about the organizational structures we use, right, and what we're using to facilitate that kind of growth.
In educational leadership, I think there's assumptions, right, in terms of the hierarchy and the top-down nature, that we have the superintendent or the principal at the top issuing directives. And when I look at our department, that is not how we view it, right? So I think those assumptions hinder the discourse, because everyone in ed leadership and our department and the preparation that we hope to provide is so that our school leaders really understand how their work affects students, how their work affects teachers, and that they're not in these positions, that they're actually engaged, looking toward a common goal, that our school leaders should see themselves as excellent teachers and thinking about the student, and it's not the power dynamic that some individuals perceive it to be.
Rob, do we want to move to the next question? I do have actually, you know, I'm going to jump outside of my realm here, but it was very provocative, the thought or the idea to be sued, right? And so, you know, to standardize, right? So growing up in a communist country where everything was mandated by the government, there's a little bit of an allergic reaction from me when I heard that, right? So, and one of the things that I think is really cool about the educational system overall, not just K-12 education and teacher preparation, but in general, is this, you know, lack of those super strict standards. So it's a long discussion, I'm sure it is, but maybe at your thoughts on how that could be achieved and why that would be, how could you do that without being too restrictive, and the risks that sometimes come with those kinds of systems?
So, anybody familiar with the Flexner Report? Okay, how physicians were trained in the up until the 20th century, early 20th century, where it was basically depends on who you studied with and what you had as an experience, and medicine decided that that wasn't good enough for their patients. And so they came up with an agreed upon body of knowledge that people were expected to learn. They came up with standards for training that included early field experiences that were highly supervised by competent people. But that big thing that really started it was an agreed upon body of knowledge that physicians were expected to know. Some good, solid core knowledge. And so I don't know that we've agreed upon that in our field. Now that's, you know, the fact that, you know, I took a few years ago, I took the 183 school psych exam. Illinois changed the rules and regs and sort of pulled a fast one on our students, and they had to go from not planning on taking a test, they were hoping to do it within a year, to having to do it within a month. So as a sign of solidarity, I plucked my $200 down and sat down and took the test with them. And I discovered that I really didn't need to know anything to pass the state test as a school psychologist. Like if you had some basic common sense, you could pass it. And I left sort of, they took my notes, since I was making notes on the items. Because I was tallying how many you could answer without any content knowledge. Because I do think we should know something, you know, that we should know some fundamental sort of things like how to teach reading or how to manage a class, or the consequences of things like zero tolerance. You know, zero tolerance increases misbehavior, it doesn't reduce it. Punitive consequences are not really good in the short term and long term for kids. They're good for adults, but I think we should sort of know some of those things.
Proposing like a strengthening of the current state exams?
Oh, I'd much rather have a teacher exam like Massachusetts got a fairly rigorous teacher examination. Okay, much more rigorous than Illinois. I'll be curious to see what happens with the changes the Illinois testing, and they're going through a revision process. So, yeah, I couldn't participate in the content ones because I wasn't the teacher, just the school psychologist. So
I'll let it go for now, but it's a great discussion.
Yeah.
May I?
So I want to ask you guys, basically pulling on this data conversation in a sec to think about, so, given all this, how should we think about, and how do you recommend we think about as the institution that we are, how do we measure or assess whether our candidates are acquiring and have the skills they need to be successful in their chosen path, and how you would think about that. But, I just wanted to kind of pull out a couple of these thoughts, and thanks for the both and. So if I ever write a book, I didn't tell you to say that, but if I ever write a book, the title is going to be How to Be Both And in an Either Or World. And no, but seriously, and I think if you think about this debate, it's really not either or. It's about how do you develop a system of thinking about, design that incorporates both of these, what feel like conflicting, that feel like a lot of tension. And think back to No Child Left Behind, Inadequate Yearly Progress, which I'm sure you all just loved as a way of measuring the effectiveness of schools, right? AYP, depending on how implemented, potential, punitive, fiasco, and basically using data as a hammer after the fact. However, one thing that approach did give us, it gave us the ability to disaggregate data by race, ethnicity, socioeconomics, and educational disadvantage that we never had before. So it totally changed the discussion about how to use data at the school level. Think about the beginning of the value-added assessment debate. I mean, seriously, we're going to use value-added assessment as the unitary measure of teaching effectiveness? That, he says, yeah, so geez. But yeah, there's one study that looked at it that said that fifth grade teacher performance, your fifth grade teacher is the biggest predictor of fourth grade teaching performance. But, think about that backwards, right? But how did that debate evolve? It evolved to one where how do you think about growth and value-added models as a component of thinking about teacher effectiveness? So I think the question for us is, what are we as an education, higher education institution, how do we think about this whole pile of data, and how do you use it in a constructive way to inform, teaching and learning? So I kind of want to come back to that, to that aspect of that. If teaching and learning is the lever, right? And that's what we're about, is developing educators. How do we know we're doing the right thing? I'm assuming that all four of you would agree that, we're not, that professional standards is not the same thing as standardization, right? And that we should have probably a pretty serious discussion about professional standards, but being very clear that we're not talking about, pacing guides and standardization either. So, but what about, measuring teaching and learning, and how do we think about that as an institution? Next question will be about technology.
I think this is a really interesting question for so many reasons. And so when I talk to fellow teacher educators and ask them, so how do you know your candidates are any good, right? And one of the, there's two common responses. One is, well, they said they had a really strong preparation experience, right? And that's because that's one of the most common sort of survey mechanisms that we use for teacher preparation. How prepared to your graduates feel about, entering the teaching profession or entering schools, and how satisfied are they with their preparation? And guess what? You can look across alternative programs, residency programs, traditional programs, all sorts of programs. And what do you imagine that students are saying about how good they feel? They're feeling great. They're feeling great because they haven't gotten out there yet. They're feeling fantastic, right? So I don't think we have, and that's good. That's very optimistic. We want that. But in fact, I'm working on a study right now that's looking at the relationship between perceptions of preparedness and actual teacher performance. Guess what the correlation is? Okay, it's not zero, but it is pretty darn low. That the correlation between how good a candidate feels about their preparation and their actual ability to engage in effective teaching is measured by, in this case, it's the REACH data in Chicago Public Schools, is very low. So we need to come up with a really different way of thinking about how we're doing this work well at the teacher prep level, right? And so the other indicator that people talk about a lot is, well, whether they got hired or not. Did candidates get hired? If candidates get hired, then we know that we're probably doing something well. And I think that's fantastic. But when someone gets hired, we don't actually know who didn't get hired and why, right? And we don't actually know why necessarily they got hired, right? There could have been a whole host of reasons. So I think we need to go past those really common indicators that we use, and value add is a whole different conversation. I'm not going there right now. But so, hiring, yes or no, we need to know more. And then perceptions of preparedness or satisfaction, not enough, right? So if we had all of the money in the world, I think what we need to do is we need to follow our graduates, right? And even if we don't have money, we can all sort of do this, right? I always tell the story about how when I was working with another teacher education program, my office was right next to the coach's office because we required multiple years of induction. So every graduate that came through our program got 3 years of postgraduate support that we raised money for, because we just felt you don't actually know how to teach well when you finish teacher preparation. There's this idea that people are ready. And I know, again, there are different perspectives about this, that there's no such thing as being ready. You can be more prepared. But actually you learn how to teach well in those first couple of years. You're still learning how to teach. So we have to find a way to learn about that. But my coaches would go out in the field and they would give me reports every day about what our graduates were able to do and not really able to do. And we would think, oh, we're doing this reading thing so well. But in fact, people were struggling with how to teach reading. And so I think the most powerful thing is getting out in the field and getting a sense of what our candidates are able to do. And obviously that can work on a small scale, but then we need to think about, so what are the measures of practice? What evidence do we have about how our folks are actually practicing, and then what our students are learning as a result? So that's just one.
Thank you for that, Kavita. I do think we have to have the same level of expectations for other professions, that most of what they're going to learn isn't going to be in the teacher preparation program, but while they're actually doing the work in the classroom. When I think about our district leaders and the work that we're doing in our doctoral program, their dissertation work is tied to the work that they actually do in districts. So they're required to evaluate programs, create plans for change, and then ultimately advocate for some type of policy. But our emphasis requires them to actually use research so they can look at their organization and think strategically about how the research process can contribute to school improvement and supporting teachers. And one of our hopes is that it's just not for the purpose of getting the doctoral degree, that they have a research project and a research agenda. And we really encourage our students to think about what they can accomplish within our program, but how they can continue to actually use it to improve beyond. So I agree, staying connected in terms of indicators, kind of seeing how our work influences key systems and structures within the district, helping them gain perspective, how they're actually supporting individuals within the organization. Those are key goals and ways that we think about measuring the effectiveness and the impact.
To piggyback on both of you, because I think I agree 100%, but so here's what I would add is, well, if we know, which there's a lot to know about what makes an effective teacher in the classroom, right? Are they, are you looking at the students' grade? Like, how are we determining that? But I'm leaving that to those who know that. That should make it back to our curriculum immediately, right? So that connection to the field, to knowing what makes an effective teacher, and the way it makes it back to the curriculum that we teach, and how we deliver it, and how we measure it. So the move to more competency based measurements in our curriculum, the assessments that we design, and I'm not wanting to go into a lot of details here, but it's going to be important that we immediately take that to the classroom, because that then will close that gap, in my opinion. It will not erase it ever, to your points, because they will still have to do the learning on the job, but it will close it, and we will then deliver as prepared as we can candidates out there. So
Got to use the mic for the Zoomers. And you're watching the Zoom chat in case folks have questions, right? Oh, plus it's right there. What do you know? So why don't we open it up to the group here for your comments, questions, observations around, backing up to the kind of Uber question here, which is, we're putting ourselves out in 2020, 2023. What are the big trends and implications for, we want to be sitting here. Okay, so I'll be Medicare eligible probably. But, what do we want this institution to look like, and what do we need to have done to get to this place? Let's just, open it up, and then I'm going to, we're supposed to adjourn at 3, so let's open it up for, 10 minutes, and then at the end, give you each a parting shot. Comments and thoughts? Gloria. I think for the Zoom folks, you need the mic.
So I'm working with principals who do a lot of work with universities in placing teachers who are in alternative programs. And what we found is that there's a disconnect between what we at the school feel like is good teaching practice and what the university is telling people, because they want people not to drop out of the program. So they'll come and they'll observe them in class and go, this is great. And people are even like making math errors. Like they don't know the content, they don't know a bunch of stuff, but they don't want them to feel so bad that they drop out. So it seems to me like instead of it just being an after thing that we collaborate more, we collaborate before we even have people in our building, so that we have some sort of inter-rater reliability on what good teaching looks like Mark was talking about. Like we got to define what that looks like. Because if you're coming in and telling somebody this is really good and then we're telling you it's not. So it seems that there should be some prior, some during conversation, and even then some after conversation, so that we keep improving on an ongoing basis. But right now there's a really huge disconnect between what we feel like is good teaching and what the transitional programs are telling people. So I think we could be innovators in designing something that actually gets us into talk with school leaders prior, so that we can talk about what it is we're looking for. What does reach look like actually in practice?
I hope this makes sense. I'm a little tired after that wonderful food. So in terms of the issues of evidence, one thing that strikes me is that since the race to the top, before that No Child Left Behind, before that whatever, evidence has been used as a tool of submission and coercion and fear. And yet evidence is beautiful when done well and displayed well. Had this conversation with Rob before. I think other people know about Edward Tufte's work, showing how with just a little bit of work we can make the evidence evidentiary and supportive and warranted and drive wonderful decision making. But we have to look at the political system that we're in the midst of, where there's devolution, declining state revenues, lots of things going back down and responsibilities put on the local. And so if we were to be forward thinking, we might think about this in, not just a reactionary movement that's afoot, but that we could be in the field and working maybe with the stream of like, yeah, we have to partner with local organizations to address local needs. I'll leave it at that.
May I just tie those two together because my question actually had to do with both Gloria's and Todd's points. As Mark brought up, when students have to graduate, we'll do anything to graduate them. And that's the same as the point about if students have to stay in a program, we'll do anything to keep them in the program. So it seems to me that talking about these issues purely theoretically without figuring out what the agendas are and how we can make them work with the agendas is really a fool's errand. In other words, you got to really figure out what is this going to look like in practice, and then and can it be done strategically, and or on the other hand, what are the unintended consequences?
I just have a comment, and I want to connect ed leadership with teacher preparation, because we always say that the most effective principal develops this reciprocity between teaching and administering, so that there are no dividing lines and we all have a common purpose. Just because you join administration doesn't make you. So that's one aspect of this. So we came through this rigorous evaluation process called REACH. And speaking to my students lately, they're saying they came up with this because a lot of teachers were being rated excellent and superior, and yet they were not progressing. And the schools were still. Now that we've done this elaborate process that takes so much time, and some people question, do we need to do this to define quality, or are there other ways of assessing that? We're getting very similar results. They're still getting excellence and superior teaching. So this is just a provocative comment because, you know, the principal is a complex, you know, source of information in the school, and we want to connect them more to teaching, but they still have to do a variety of other things and details that sometimes, many times, takes away from that instructional leadership strategy. Anyway, just a comment.
So I just want to make a quick comment on the evidence issue, which I think is just kind of, I guess this got banged into my head. So I used to, in a prior life, run one of the Department of Education's regional educational laboratories during the time when the Institute for Education Science was pretty much solely obsessed with random control, with random control trial studies, right? And I think the observation at that time, a number of us felt that you know, this idea that an RCT was the gold standard was you know, overstating, and that research method, you know, the gold standard was the matching your research method to the research question. At the same time, our sense of the evidence and the evidentiary body in the education space was really, really weak in terms of rigor. And so really, you know, I think you've seen over the past decade, really a focus on what our evidentiary standards ought to be, what constitutes good evidence, as a bit of a separate issue from how do you use the data, right? And how do you move from a regime that is, you know, data and evidence for punitive accountability purposes to data for formative and continuous improvement purposes. And I think for us, you know, you guys talked about this mountain of data that we're under, you know, data that doesn't, you know, data becomes information, becomes knowledge, the mountain of stuff. And I think you've seen this in the K-12 data-driven decision-making, you know, work for quite a while, and it's basically lamented too much data, not enough, you know, information and knowledge that is generating the kinds of conversations in our schools that we need to be having about evidence. So at any rate, just an observation. Other comments, thoughts, reactions? What does this mean, you know, this discussion, which obviously has a lot of complexity and pieces to it, what does this mean for us as a college of education and our direction? And you know, what are your big takeaways? You know, I'd put that question to the group, and then I'd ask you all, as we close, for a parting, you know, shot from each of your perspectives, what you think the big takeaways are. Marjorie.
One of the things that's always struck me when I read the literature, the research literature, is that there are quantitative variables and there are qualitative variables that make a difference in how children learn. And I think one of the takeaways, I'm trained myself as a quantitative researcher. I do a lot of work in the qualitative area, actually, so I see both sides. I'm talking about the University of Chicago research, for instance, on knowing if children know that they are cared about and they are respected, they actually gain in academic achievement. It's a qualitative kind of social emotional variable. At the same time, we also know there's a robust literature on reading that looks at certain kinds of quantitative data that can be quantified and also make a tremendous difference. I would say our takeaway is that we we give that kind of orientation to our students, do train them how to look at what kinds of research methods and research paradigms are appropriate for investigating both kinds of data that will help students learn, and teaching them how to do that.
Thank you. On Zoom, comments, if you want to stick it in the chat, feel free. I'm sorry for standing in front of the camera and giving you a great shot on my back this entire
Hi,
time.
this is Frate Fron, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I may have missed it, but
Ruth, hang on just a sec. We got to turn on the speaker. Oh. Hang on. We got to turn you up.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to turn the volume way up so she can
Okay. Okay, you're on.
This is a Frate Fron, and I may have missed it, but I did not hear in the conversation.
No, it didn't work.
Sarah has to turn her microphone on.
Hey, I thought you got to turn your mic up on your computer.
If I make it, I don't know. Okay, forget it. If I make it mute, it's I don't know.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Give me a buzz, and I'll write it down after the meeting, and we'll get your coming out to, or you could write it in the chat. So I apologize. The volume, you guys on Zoom, isn't working in the room here. Can I ask you guys? It's just top of the hour, so I'd like to ask each of you. First of all, thank you so much for being at the front of the room and being put on the spot. But can I ask you for a parting word of where you would like to see this conversation go and what the big implications are for us as a college? And I'm going to give it to Andy as our technology guy first.
Okay. Well, for me, it's really clear that developing a very clear approach on how we make these improvements and stay connected to the field. The college, I'm not sure where it is right now, but that's because I'm not in those conversations. But having that very clear approach on how we are connected to what's happening, to what we call effectiveness in the field, and how that's translated into our curriculum and the delivery of it, I think needs to be very clearly stated, and we need to be very clear how we approach that in our practices, in course design, in decision making for curriculum changes, and trickling down from there. But that's what I'm gathering from this, is that we, that needs to be there if it's not.
I would say being very deliberate in our practice and our collaboration, really tuning in to what we're learning from students, and making sure that as a department we're kind of reflecting on our student needs and making the necessary refinements to assist in their development.
A bunch of disconnected notes. So how many have kids or have had kids in school? Raise your hand. How many had years where you didn't get lucky? Or your kids didn't get lucky? Getting a good teacher should not be luck. When you're in middle school, guess what the odds are? You got 7, 8, 9 teachers, sometimes more in a year. And you know what the impact of a good teacher is on student achievement? There's plenty of data that a good teacher can impact kids' years of development. And the question is, how do we raise the tide and actually reduce variability in teacher training? There's more variability teacher to teacher within a building than there is building to building on terms of teaching practices. Our kids should not have to get lucky to get good instruction. And part of wanting to be in higher education is to try to have an opportunity to impact that. So even the poorest candidate ends up with really good skills. So disconnected notes. Assessing knowledge is much easier than assessing skill. Okay, everybody knows that. That's not an excuse for not assessing knowledge. And I don't think, at least in our program, we do a good enough job of that. You know, this is a strange institution that doesn't have something like a finals week. Now, finals week, good, bad, or indifferent, I can tell you sometimes what that communicates to students, whether faculty like to teach or not teach. Sometimes I would give a final, sometimes I would not. But you know what? I would argue it gives students the idea that they're not accountable for bodies of knowledge sometimes, and that sometimes worries me, that institutionally we're communicating unintentionally the wrong thing. We've been working to actually try to practice what we preach, which is really hard to do. I'm inherently a hypocrite. So one of the things we've tried to do is increase the quality of our own teaching practices. So we have identified the critical vocabulary, which is really hard for 4 people to agree on. Critical vocabulary you need to learn across 4 years or 3 years to be a school psychologist. But we're trying to make that explicit teaching of vocabulary as part of every one of our syllabi, that we can embed in our instruction, saying this is a really important term to know. It's in your vocabulary. We've been able to try to link it to some of what's called vocabulary linking routines. We're trying to identify great books that you don't just read in one class, but you might read in another class, and you might actually read some things again. We're trying to design our curriculum so students just don't read things once. Graduate students read for the purposes of what? Getting it done, right? If you were a graduate student, do you remember those days? We try to plan that 25% of what students read once, they'll probably read again, because the second or third time they read it, they're probably going to read it differently because they've acquired content, knowledge, and life experience. These are pedagogical things that we'd like to be able to do. And we're trying to teach from what's called the big ideas focus. We know that students will retain about 10% of what we're trying to teach them. So as instructors, if we're not clear about what we think are the 10% most important things to learn, how is that going to be communicated to learners? So there are a billion other things I could talk about, because this is sort of fun to actually engage in scholarship with other colleagues. I wish we did much more of this stuff sometimes, and it's fun. So,
Kavitha, last word.
No pressure. All right, so I guess actually what I'm thinking about connects to almost something that each one of you have said, and I'm thinking about Dan Lordy's work, right? And he talks about the apprenticeship of observation and how people everywhere think that they know how to teach because they've experienced the institution of schooling, right? And that we're going to continue to teach the way that we were taught, because teacher education in and of itself is not currently organized as a particularly intense or strong intervention. And so what is it going to take for us to be a strong intervention? And I love the point that you made about the variability of teachers as being high within schools as across schools, and actually the same is true for teacher preparation programs. When you look across teacher preparation programs, we might think that program A is going to be better than program B and is going to be better than that in fact the most variability comes from within. So how do we tighten up the variability, reduce the variability, right, within our own work? And I think some of the ideas have already been shared, but I'm a big fan, as some of you already know, about coherence, right? And it's not just enough to get the right words on a page, but then to make sure those words have meaning, and that those phrases and words that have meaning to us actually translate into our course decision making and our content and our assessments all the way through. And that how do we build a vision of practice that is shared and coherent and comes all the way through. But we can't do that. We can't move to a space of coherence until we as an institution give ourselves the time and space to learn and dig deep and inquire and understand the connections between our own practice and the research and building these ideas together. So I think we need to get really smart and creative about how we buy time to do this. You know, how do we use our faculty meetings? How do we use our program meetings? How do we come together? Because this is really important work, but we have to engage in it together. And I'm really looking forward to doing that with all of you.
Well, thank you all. And thank you all for coming and for a really interesting conversation. Have a great weekend. You want the final word?
I just wanted to tell you that if you enjoyed this, Mark and I are going to do a book club on this book that you keep getting emails from Mark about, called The Language at the Speed of Sight, and how fun it would be to be in the same room to actually have a conversation instead of email exchanges. So look for an email and join the book club. We don't know when, maybe summer, maybe fall, but look for it. We're gonna do this and engage in more scholarly conversation with different perspectives. Thanks, everyone.
So as NCE closes up the meeting this afternoon, we want to think one more moment about excellence in curriculum and instruction. And we just wanted to thank our colleagues for sharing their expertise. We don't do that often enough. So I hope you guys have a great weekend. Sorry for shouting.
Thank you.
I know.